hope you enjoyed this episode of Audio Signals Podcast, hosted by Marco Ciappelli. If you learned something new and this conversation made you think, then take a moment to rate this show and add it to your favorite podcast player. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and share this episode with your friends, family, and colleagues. We invite you to come back for more stories and follow Marco Ciappelli on his social media as he continues musing on stories, storytelling, and storytellers.
Well, hello everybody, this is Marco Ciappelli. Welcome to another episode of Audio Signals. And last time that I have this guest, at this point, a friend of mine, we're sharing plans and what we're going to do in the next few months before we start recording. We had a great conversation, and my indecision was, if you remember, Alex, welcome to the show for the people looking at you. We were like, this is a conversation that could either go into audio signals or redefining society, because it very much was both technological and storytelling, because we were talking about AI and the application in art and all the form of art, but in particular in writing, because that's what you mostly do. Although I remember when you introduce yourself with a person wearing many hats. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to let you introduce yourself once more for the people that didn't listen to the first episode, but I would definitely invite and put the link to listen to that one about AI and the arts. And today, I'm not going to say what we talk about yet. I'm going to do it after you introduce yourself, and feel free to drop it, to say what is the plan for our conversation today. So Alex, welcome to the show again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back. I'm Alex Shvartsman from Brooklyn, New York. And as Marco said in his introduction, I wear many hats that all pertain to science fiction and fantasy. I write novels and short stories. I have several fantasy novels published to date, and about 120 different short stories. I edit anthologies. I have about 15 different anthologies, which are collections of stories by other authors that are out. And you can see one of them that we talked about in the last episode over here, The Digital Estate. I also translate fiction from the Russian, and I've worked with video game companies, movie studios, TV production companies, publishers, etc., to help bring great creative works from the Russian language to the Anglophone readers. And I do lots and lots of other stuff like game design and talking to, some technology consulting. So it's all sorts of like weird different hats that essentially come down to creativity and being able to do things that I find fascinating and interesting and not boring, which I think is a very important part of life.
Yeah, I love that. And I think we touched on that last time too, which is, when you have the creative mind, you kind of need to use it in different places, right? Adapted to different situation, but it's important that you stay still in the realm of the things that is your core, like in your case, sci-fi and all that come with that. So you mentioned that you translate, and that's the hint on what we're going to talk about today. And that was an idea that came up, I think, right after we finished recording the first episode. And I think it also comes from the fact that, I'm Italian. I speak two languages, Spanish too, but I wouldn't translate from Spanish. And we were talking about different cultures, and you had this idea of, why don't we talk about the importance of translating, which is not just a grammatical language adaptation, but there is actually the whole culture behind it, and you kind of need to be a writer in order to write. So I was like, wow, that sounds just great about storytelling, because we all grew up with reading, I don't know, Hemingway or Swift or Steinbeck and, Shakespeare itself. And I remember Dante that you actually need a translator in Italian as well, because you can't read that, what he wrote back in the 1300s. So great topic, no script whatsoever. So where do you want to start?
Well, I'll start at the beginning. So I grew up in Ukraine with Russian as my first language, Ukrainian being my second language, and then eventually English. And so my first experience with science fiction and fantasy was reading it in translation. I was reading primarily works by American, British, and French authors, and they were, scarce. They were difficult to obtain, living in the Soviet Union. But the ones that I could get my hands on, they were, I didn't speak English at the time, so I was reading them in Russian translation. And so the value of translation is incredibly important to my own development as a reader and ultimately a writer, because those are the foundational stories that influenced me more so than anything else at the young, impressionable age. And so when I first started writing fiction, which took me a very long time to get into because I kept thinking my English would never be good enough, because it is my third language, and because, I came here as a teenager already, so it wasn't something that I picked up at a very young age. I have an accent, as you can hear. I certainly still make an occasional, grammatical mistake. So it was all things that, caused me fear and prevented me from trying my hand at writing. And when I did finally overcome it and start writing fiction, I was as surprised as anybody to start getting stuff published and actually succeed to at least a modicum of success in this field. So once I've been doing that for a while, and I got my expertise where I feel like I can write confidently and comfortably. I also kind of remembered the joy of reading translated fiction and thought, wouldn't it be fun if I took a short story that I really liked and translated it for my Anglophone friends to also be able to enjoy? Because there's very few pieces of short fiction, especially contemporary short speculative fiction, that are translated from Russian. And so I obtained the author's permission and I translated the story, and it was a great success. People were very interested. They enjoyed it. They wanted more. And so I kind of stumbled into this process where I would just, curate my own translations, because I would contact the authors, and invariably they said yes, because everybody wants their work to be read in English. It's still kind of like the most important language for speculative fiction, at least. And so I would translate the story, and then I would submit it to prestigious short fiction markets in the same way as I would submit my own work. And those editors were very excited as well, because they were not getting very many translations at all from any languages. I mean, to this day, translations are fairly rare, and most editors go out of their way to seek them out, because they want different perspectives and exciting fiction from around the world. And so these stories were getting published in most of the top science fiction journals and anthologies. And then someone reached out to me from a video game company asking if I would do some work for them for hire. And this kind of snowballed into projects with movie studios, with translating scripts and treatments and things like that, with with production companies, with publishing companies. And so I've done a great body of translation work, most of which by necessity has not actually been seen by the public, because a lot of the time you translate even things like complete novels that are purely for internal consumption. And so like I would translate a novel for a major video game company set in one of their universes, and it would be read by people in other languages within the company, but they have no intention of publishing it. But they would still pay me. Mm-hmm. So a lot of that work is not available. What is available is a great many short stories that I've translated from a variety of authors, and I've worked with authors from Ukraine. I've worked with authors from Belarus, from Israel, from Kazakhstan, and of course from different parts of Russia. Because Russia is the lingua franca of that entire region, just like English is kind of a more of a global language as well, not just spoken in the United States and the UK.
Right.
And many of these works are available online for free, so people are welcome and encouraged to check them out. And I spend a lot of time thinking about translation and talking about it at conventions and on panels and podcasts like this, because it's a really important way. And I kind of see it as being a cultural ambassador, because you're taking a great creative work from one culture and one language, and you're bringing it and modifying it by necessity to people who do not speak that language, and sort of trying to do your best to make sure that they can enjoy it in a similar way to how the native speakers would enjoy the original work.
Right. So an observation here is, I think I learned most of my English as a teenager by translating songs, from music, just to try to understand, what the Doors were saying, what Jim Morrison was saying with that song, or Pink Floyd, or whatever it was. But, it took me a while then where I can just think in the language, like in English, or dream in English. And I'm like you. I mean, I do have some issues sometimes with a word or another. But what I am thinking is, it's not just the language, it's understanding the culture, right? And I realize sometimes that there are certain things that just cannot be translated because it's kind of like that joke, it doesn't work in that language. So where is that thin line that as a translator, you adopt also the book or the movie or whatever it is, and how much creative freedom do you get in order to deliver that story without changing the intention of the writer? I think that's the trick.
So the answer to that question largely depends on the purpose of your translation. It really varies. If you are working with an academic translation, so if you're doing something, let's say you're taking Dante, right, and you're creating an academic translation for students to study the original work and to comment on it, etc., your job is to be as faithful to the text as possible. You will use copious footnotes and explanations, and you will sacrifice readability. You will pretty much throw readability out of the window and drive over it with your car, just so you can stay faithful to the author. When you're doing literary translation and your primary purpose is for the readers to be able to enjoy the end result, then your job is to betray the author as much as possible. You're working for the reader, not for the author. So you will make whatever necessary changes and adjustments you have to make in order to breach that gap in understanding that you're talking about. So if there's a concept that is cultural, that is difficult to translate, if there's a pun that doesn't work, like something relies on a rhyme that doesn't work in the target language, your job is, and it's part of the greatest fun that I have as a translator working on these things, is solving these kinds of puzzles, figuring out, okay, what do I do with this text that will essentially, my goal is to make sure that when you're reading it in English, it evokes the same feelings and emotions in you as the original text does in the readers who are interacting with it in the Russian language. The text does not have to be identical. You find ways, and there's many, many techniques that you would work on in order to make those changes. I will offer you an example.
Yeah.
I translated a story a number of years back, which was largely considered to be untranslatable by fellow translators, because not on it. So this is a magical realism story by K.A. Tirina, which relies on essentially the plot relies on the young protagonist writing things down in order to influence the world through magical means, writing things down and misspelling them. And so the title of the story itself in Russian is "Без названия," with the word "без" misspelled, so that if you read it spelled correctly, the title of the story would mean "without a name" or "untitled." But if you read it the way that the title of the story was spelled, it would read as Demon of the Name. And the whole Bias Nazvania thing is actually used in the plot of the story, so it is difficult to walk too far away from that. And there are many, many intentional misspellings that create essentially like this magic, or maybe create the magical influence. Maybe it's actually just a real world and the child is imagining things. So it's kind of a very, like, that's why the story is magical realism. So it was a bear to translate that story, but I did it, and it was published and republished, and very well received. So what I did with the title in English is the story title in English is Untilted. So it's essentially the word untitled that's intentionally misspelled, and untilted, gives that like the tilted thing, gives that like weird shaken element that I was looking for. Yes, I had to sacrifice the whole demon reference because that would be very difficult to come up with, but there was no actual demon in the story. It was just the way to kind of show that a small spelling change can completely influence and change the meaning of the text. And so that passage in the text just goes from the child writing untitled at the top of the node that he's writing and changing it to untilted. So that's the sort of thing that you have to do, and the sort of creative solutions you have to look for in order to not only translate but also make the story accessible to your readers.
Right. Now when you went through the title, I'm like, it is based on exactly what you don't want as a translator, which is misspelling words and not understanding the meaning. So I kind of felt like it, when you throw it there, that it was untranslatable. And I think in the end, did you have a back and forth with the author that wrote the book? So because I think that's another thing. Like, do you work with the author, or you're doing something that is posthumous, and so there is no way to work with the author? Or
in this particular case, I was very fortunate that the author is around, alive, and understands English well enough to be able to actually read and approve the translation. That is the best possible case scenario.
Right. You're doing it right. You're almost like co-rewriting it with
right.
them. Yeah.
Well, in most cases, the author will maybe have just a few, very select comments. They're not really seeking to completely rework your translation unless something has gone horribly wrong. Right. But this is the best case scenario. Very often, you will work with authors who simply do not have good enough knowledge of English to be able to review and give you feedback. Sometimes they will ask their friends to take a look at it who do speak English, just so that they make sure that the translator didn't just completely, just go off on their own doing something weird. And yes, I have worked with works that are posthumous as well. And that's the worst possible scenario, because you don't have the author you can reach out to in any language and just say, hey, I don't understand what you did here. What did you mean when you wrote this? What were you trying to say? Having access to the author is a huge privilege in that sense, and it does absolutely make your job easier. When you're working with a text by an author who has passed, then you have to just try to, if it's a famous enough text, then there's probably some academic reviews and articles about it that you can read that may help you understand it. So if you're translating a classic work, for example, but if you're translating a more obscure text, then your best bet is to just have other speakers, who carry both languages, review the translation and hopefully identify anything that you may have misunderstood. Now, no translation is perfect. Even absolutely professional translators who do this for a living, that's all they do. They still make mistakes, and sometimes the mistakes could even be like somewhat intentional. They're just making a creative choice rather than a mistake. And this is why it is not a technical endeavor. It's absolutely a creative endeavor. And those decisions are what separates your translation from anybody else's. And if you look at any popular work, if you look at, let's say, the Iliad, there are probably at least a dozen different translations, and you can almost track how the language changes and how the translations change over the ages, because that's the work that's been translated many, many times into English over hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can see how modern translations are handling things with modern sensitivities and kind of like modern understanding. And they're making a lot of creative choices that are very different from the original works. And so anybody who is very interested in the art of translation could take a classic work from another language and just compare the opening pages, which are usually free to preview on Amazon and places like that, and just kind of read the opening page of each and see what different translators have done, because usually it's going to be very different and fascinating.
So there is one thing that I think is very important, and you kind of hint into it. So time, right? Like the period and the change of the language, the culture, but also be faithful to the context, right? I mean, I can translate Shakespeare today or Victor Hugo and put the computer or something that wasn't there, or any reference to some language, new words that we're using today. So that's definitely one of the very important things, but also context in terms of cultural context. And I'll give you an example. I always think that when you watch a movie, for example, or you read a book, like I mentioned Victor Hugo, I mean, I'm like, I'm going to try to read The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And being from early 1800, I believe, but don't quote me on that, but I think it is about that time, is such a different way to write. It's kind of slow, it's very descriptive, it's very, in the particular of the first scene where there is the big festivity going on in Paris. And then I think like, yeah, but at the time you had to do that because we didn't have TV or photography, so the artist, the writer, had to be extremely visual in depicting what was going on. So again, context of what do we have, the way we think as people in that time, in that city, in that part of the world versus another part of the world, another time. And it seems to me it's very, very daunting to consider all of that. And I agree with you. It is not a technical. It's very much sociological. It's very much creative. It's very much a lot of things, but certainly not technical.
Well, in this kind of a case, you absolutely have to think long and hard of what the voice of the story is going to be in English. Very few translators today are going to choose to match the archaic language of the original text, right? So you still want to modernize. And when I say you modernize the text, I certainly don't imply that we should introduce anachronisms into the story, like mentioning a computer or a car, or anything like that, what you mentioned. What I mean is that the text of the story is flowery and very, I should say, inefficient, and not the way that American and British readers have been trained to kind of consume novels. And the concept of a novel as we know it today is pretty much defined by Hemingway. He is the one who really reshaped he kind of got rid of a lot of the flowery language that we had prior to his works. And it's during his time period that we've kind of gotten closer to what we understand today as the format of a novel. So even if you read a work that was originally written in English, and you go back to the 18th century, you kind of feel that difference of like how flowery it is. And so when you're translating a work by Hugo or Tolstoy or anyone from back then, you have to find a happy medium where you're not completely reworking their clearly genius work, for it has to be to have survived the test of time like that. But at the same time, you want to make it accessible to the current readers. So when you're translating Shakespeare, people reading Shakespeare in English, even native speakers are often, it's almost like a foreign language to them because there's so many words and so many phrases that are being used that are out of use. Mm-hmm. So when I read Shakespeare in English, I probably have to go to the dictionary quite a lot But when I read him in translation in Russian, I don't need the dictionary at all because the translations were being performed in the 20th century. And while the language is still trying to emulate this beautiful form, these beautiful sonnets, the way that Shakespeare wrote, I recognize all the words or almost all of the words. So I think that's a good balance to strive for, where you're still keeping like some of the flowery stuff, but you're also not intentionally leaning into the archaic words and making it more difficult for the reader. Because if you're translating this book for the purpose of people reading it for pleasure, if you're translating it for an academic press and you're publishing it maybe along the side with the original French text in the same book, then you want to be as close to the original as possible, slavishly so. But the text will come off very stilted, and often people choose not to read translations because their expectation is that the work will be stilted. Because unfortunately, even professional translators very often are not themselves writers, and so they produce works that don't flow as well in the English language, and even with a lot of interference from their editors, it doesn't get fixed 100%. And so when me and other people who translate and write both, when we work on our texts, we try to smooth it out as much as possible so that you, the reader, can appreciate the text and not stumble over the fact that, like, yes, of course, you will have the setting, and the setting will be in another country, and the names of the characters will be from another country, and so you're going to get that sense of that this is not taking place in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. But you're also, if we do our job right, going to be able to enjoy the smooth experience of reading a novel that you're accustomed to, thanks to Hemingway and those who came after him.
Right. Well, a lot to think about here, because I'm envisioning a couple of things. Like, for example, if you are J.K. Rowling, when you have Harry Potter read all over the world, and you probably get to the second book, and maybe even after the first, it's going to be translated in every language, right? And then you have to adapt it to the book. I mean, the book to the movie to the video games, and there is always a never-ending adaptation that you have to do, and you need to think about the audience. And in that case, she probably has some kind of creative control over that, or whom for her. And then you have other situation where, again, you don't get the feedback from Shakespeare, you don't get the feedback from Dante. And you made me think, as an Italian, as a kid, you do all those 3 big book when you're way too young to really understand what's going on. And it's not really written in Italian. You need the translation, even as an Italian. And then in school, the teacher choose the expert notes that is being interpreted by who they believe did a better job, not much into the translation, but into explaining what Dante meant when you meet this person in this part of the Inferno or in the Paradiso, and sometimes the interpretation is different too, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So
And
it's a daunting job.
I mean, once you know that Virgil is his guide, right? If you haven't read Virgil and you don't know what his writing and his philosophy and everything about him was like, then how much are you really missing, right, from the work? The people that Dante wrote the books for, the people who were able to read and who had the finances to buy the book, and they would have all probably read Virgil. That's his expectation, right, as a writer. So it's like, if I'm making a reference, if I'm writing today and I'm making a reference to, well, let's say J.K. Rowling, who I just mentioned, most of our contemporaries will be familiar with her work. But if somehow I'm lucky and my work survives 500 years, people are reading it 500 years from now, and if I make a reference to Harry Potter, there's no guarantee they're going to know what that means. So yeah, it's not just a language problem; it's a cultural problem. When you always take you're always taking a risk when you're adding cultural references into your story, because those references may not be understood or may be understood differently, even 10 or 20 years down the line, let alone centuries.
Let me ask you one more thing, and I think we'll have this conversation going in the future, because I'm thinking now we could talk about adaptation, not just translation, and talk about the connection with movies or with TV series or video games, and you have the experience in all of that. But in this case, I was thinking that if you have a choice, and you do, because you speak fluent and you can write fluently, and I can do that in Italian and English. Do you feel that you can express yourself better in a language or in another? Or do you think one story is more fit for like Russian or one for English, thinking also the reader? So again, it's not just about the language that you choose, but is who is your target audience? Because I have the conundrum all the time.
So as a writer, the conundrum is removed from me because while my Russian is actually very good, my vocabulary is good, I can't write in Russian, and I can't translate professionally into Russian. A popular misconception is that when you have a translator between two languages, most people assume that it's a two-way street. And you kind of, like if you translate between Russian and English, then you can effortlessly just work in both directions. But that's not the case. Almost all professional translators work from a target language, from a source language into a target language. So for me, I have a lot of experience writing in English. And so I can read and understand and absorb in Russian, and then I can bring it to the Anglophone readers in English. I have absolutely no skill in translating literary translation from English into Russian, nor could I write my fiction in Russian without probably taking a couple of years to, I mean, certainly if I put my mind to it, I could do both after a while, but it would be a lot of work and a lot of relearning. So my job is to import this culture from the Russian language into the English language. And so I can express myself. So if we're talking and we both speak both languages, and this often happens in the immigrant community here where I'm among other Russian speakers, a lot of the time, whichever of the two languages you're speaking to each other, you will pepper it with the words from the other language, because you will tend to opt for whatever language has the most precise word or phrase that you can express what you're trying to say. But for literary translation, that's almost everyone I know who's doing this who's doing this professionally. They have a language pairing that they're working in, so they're not going to attempt to translate it, to translate the other way.
Okay. Well, I guess I have that issue, because if I can decide sometimes, even just an email or a letter or anything, or copywriting, for example, I could say, well, if I have to write it in Italian, it's going to be a different approach. It's not just a different language, it's a different approach, because I have to appeal to that culture from an advertising perspective, of course. But also, I think when you're writing a short story or a story, you have to decide where do you start, at least for me. And I still am in that conundrum myself. But but it's interesting to, I think, for the audience here, we could kind of like summarize here, if you want to, what are, I don't know, the main step that you need to take as someone that is in charge of translating a writing piece into another language. And the question for you is also, do this step change depending on the language or the culture I'm translating into? So I'm thinking, if I'm translating in Japanese, which I couldn't, how much more of a cultural approach I have to take versus Italian to French or Italian to Spanish or something similar?
The most important element is that you have to know and understand your audience as well as possible. Typically, the best translators are ones for whom the target language is native and not the source language. I am actually the exception to that, since for me, the source language is a native language. And I'm not alone. There's a number of great translators who are, who have that as well. But generally speaking, it is preferred that if you have an imbalance between the languages, which most of us do, very few speak both languages with exact same fluency, that the literary translator should be more fluent in the target language than the source language. And the reason for that is, again, your job is to please your audience. Your job is to make the translation as enjoyable, accessible, and understandable by your readers, and your readers are going to be reading it in the target language. So whether you're working in, translating into Japanese, into Russian, any language at all, you will have different challenges based on how that language works. Whether they have, for example, many languages, including Russian, have a formal U and an informal U, which English does not. So anytime you're going to translate a conversation or a text especially a conversation from English into Russian, you have to choose how are these characters related to each other? How close are they? Will they use the formal U or an informal U, which is a choice that the person originally writing the text in English never had to face at all.
Yeah.
So these are challenges that are unique to different language pairings. But at the end of the day, you want to make it so that you're never throwing the reader out of the story, that it makes sense. Because if you're in that kind of story, if a commoner approaches the king and starts talking to him with an informal you, the reader will be like, wait, what? Like, is he intentionally being rude? Is he just reckless?
Yeah.
Like, why is he doing this, right?
Yeah.
So you have to think about those choices and be really, really conscious of them and of the social, of the social interactions that are appropriate in that language and at the time of the story too. So that's where that kind of stuff comes into play, really, and it's a great puzzle and one of the funnest things for me, because anybody can sit there and translate straightforward text, right? Like, it's not that interesting if there's no challenge in it. But once you get
AI can do that, but that's
and AI can do that
again.
badly because the AI does not understand any subtext.
Exactly.
Yeah, if you're using,
I was hinting you. I was poking you.
Yeah, idiomatic language. If you're using anything where you're saying, what your words are saying one thing, but your meaning is something else. An AI or any kind of automated translator like Google Translate and similar, they're completely incapable of understanding that. So for now, my job is very safe. Like, I don't think that's going to change in the next few years.
And I love that you used the example of the formal you, because we do have that in Italian, right? So there is so much you have to consider. How long you've known this person? Is it older than you? In Italian, you normally ask somebody older than you, even if it's not older, but you just met in a business environment. You ask permission if you can use you instead of he, right? So there is definitely a lot, and I can see how the target language should be the original culture as well, to get all this nuances that you just described. So it is a puzzle. You use that word quite a bit. That is a puzzle, and I think that's the fun part, that challenge to do it successfully, I guess. And I hope the audience will get this as a fun, interesting conversation. And then now, when they do read something, or when they do listen to something in another language, maybe they have to think about all of that. So, and I have a bird here that I don't know if you can hear it, but he's really pissed right now. So.
I think you may have heard my dog snoring as well. She was sleeping next to me.
No, I didn't.
I just spoke to her. I'm like, wake up, stop snoring.
That's all good. That's all good. We're in the nature here. All right. Well, Alex, this was, again, no doubt about it, a great conversation. I knew it was going to be like this. And I don't know, maybe if we decided to chat again after all this summer travel, I like the idea of the adaptation from one media to another. I think that will be a very, very fun conversation to have.
Sure. So I'm a little less experienced with that, but
we could bring someone with us and have that conversation. But I think it's a topic that is very important for storytelling, and this being a show for storytelling, storytellers, and stories, I think is really important in a global world that we're all sharing a lot of the same culture, or at least we should consume more of the other people's culture to understand the difference and that allow us to live better together. So I found the moral to the story as well here. And at this point, I want to thank you for being on this conversation with me again. Always a pleasure. And I want to thank the audience for listening to us, and follow and subscribe. And there'll be all the notes to get in touch with Alex and to listen to our prior conversation, and definitely read all the books and the stories that you wrote. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And if anyone is interested in checking out some of these translations, some of the stories, many of them are available online for free. And you can go to my website, which is just my name, alexshvartsman.com, and just click on the bibliography page, and there's a section for translations there. So yeah, you can definitely sample some of that and read some of my nonfiction writing on translation on the website as well.
Perfect. You guys do that. And I'll catch with you on the next episode of Audio Signal Podcast. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Audio Signals Podcast, hosted by Marco Ciappelli. If you learned something new and this conversation made you think, then take a moment to rate this show and add it to your favorite podcast player. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and share this episode with your friends, family, and colleagues. We invite you to come back for more stories and follow Marco Ciappelli on his social media as he continues musing on stories, storytelling, and storytellers.